Welcome, everyone. My name is Gretchen Rowe, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome Katie Webster Rowe to this conversation today about helping kids with handwriting. This episode of the Demi Learning Show is here and available for you all, and we hope the information that you find will be absolutely amazing. I'm going to be monitoring the Q&A today, so if you have questions as Katie and I talk, please don't hesitate to ask them. We want to make sure that the information that we share is valuable to you. So I have pulled that up here on my computer, and I'm going to let Katie introduce herself. Although I know her well, I want you to know her as well as I do.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Rowe. I'm an occupational therapist from Maryland, and excited to be here with my sweet mother-in-law. I just am excited to bring a wealth of information, as much as we can cover in this time, on handwriting and just the importance of it developmentally and neurologically. I have a background in using horses in my practice. So I am a hippotherapy clinical specialist, and I have had my own practice for 6 years. And right now I'm actually working both, but I'm working in a preschool with 3 and 4-year-olds. So
I think that's really wonderful. Now, Katie also has 2 children of her own, so she has a lot of practical application to share with you all as well. And lest you think it's just pure nepotism that allowed me to invite Katie here today, let me tell you that this subject is one that more parents ask us about than any other outside the realms of pure academics. And the reason that I wanted to have Katie have this conversation today is because she has taught me so much. This webinar, when we did it in 2020, was one of the most best attended in that particular year. And I wanted to update the information that we have provided before, and why not go to the source, right? So Katie, and in talking, we're going to talk about all ages today, but let's begin with what are some of the things parents should look for in a child's readiness to write before they even begin the writing process? What are some developmental things that you look for in knowing a child is ready to begin the writing process?
yeah, that's a good question. So generally, I look at interest. Are they eager to pick up a crayon and color? Are they looking for your random pens around the house and starting to scribble on things? Also, is there attention to task there? Like, are they able to sit and play for a good 5 minutes at least before moving on to the next thing? Are they meeting their regular milestones for, like, walking and hopping and running around? Are they able to sit up in the chair nice and tall? Those are kind of the basic, like, building blocks that we want to make sure are in place for them to then start to apply more of the pre-writing skills.
So why sit up in a chair? Why hopping?
Yeah. So a lot of our gross motor movements, right, our big body movements are going to inform our fine motor ability. And so being able to sit up in the chair, we have to have a posture to be able to, that's stable, to be able to use our hands in those fine movement patterns, and to, have the stability to create good handwriting, or even just nice fine motor movements.
So Katie, can we set expectations? Do we expect that a young child can write like an older child? I mean, I realize that's kind of an obvious question, but often we get parents who have young children who are frustrated because their motor mechanics aren't where they think they should be. So can you kind of give us a timeline?
Yeah, so I typically don't encourage specific handwriting like what we look at or look for in letter formation until at least 4 or 5. We tend to like to, in preschool, start a little early, and we have to keep in mind that their hands are still forming, like they're still growing, and they're still not like their joints aren't solidified, right?
Can I show you the picture
Yes.
that we talked about? I think
Yes.
it's important for parents to see this picture. Let me see if I can do it
Yeah.
without getting the glare on it. This
Yeah.
is the child's hand here on the right side. The bones aren't even fully connected as they are
Yep.
in this teenager's hand on the other side. So I
Yep.
think that makes a huge difference for parents to understand.
Yeah, just knowing kind of where they are in developing and their body's readiness, right? Um, at earlier than 3, you're really working on just play, right? You're working on all of those gross motor movements that are going to be important for later. It sets the foundation. So you want to get on the floor, you want them crawling, you want them, um, playing with the ball back and forth, creating visual motor. Awareness and body awareness. And then after 3, you can start to work on let's sit at the table for a little bit and do some Play-Doh or do some of those activities that are going to help them really get comfortable with their hands, right? And then 4 to 5 is really where you're starting to solidify their understanding of the alphabet and their numbers, and then how to write them and how to form them. And then above, 6 and above, that's when you're starting to fine tune all of those skills, and their handwriting is really, it really becomes their own and their own style of engaging in that way.
So if I am the parent of a 5-year-old who is not yet interested in coloring, picking up a
Mhm.
pencil, should I be concerned?
Yes, at that point. Typically, if I don't see interest by around 3, that's gonna give me a little bit of a red flag. And then definitely by 5, if they're, like, resistive to it or not even showing interest, then I might seek an occupational therapist or even just, like, talk to my pediatrician about it and see what their thoughts are. That can definitely be a red flag there for some other things that we might wanna consider. And typically it's either there's something hard about it or there's something that's not appealing, about that process for them.
So can you give me an idea of what might be some red flags? What do
Yeah.
you
So
look for?
yeah. If your child's really resistant even just to sitting at the table, if they're struggling with holding just even utensils like during eating, or if they're struggling to want to participate in school, or they're coming, if they're in preschool or kindergarten at that point, if we're talking about 5-year-olds, are they coming home having like harder days than good days? Um, Sometimes, it could even you could see an uptick in behaviors as far as like just general agitation and non-compliance in other areas. But generally, if they're having a hard time, they're not getting themselves dressed or they're not like doing the typical things that have fine motor involvement, they're not able to like open up a water bottle or they're asking for more help or having struggles with opening packages, those kinds of things. That tends to tip me off that there's some fine motor concern.
And what happens then?
Then we typically will, I would obviously recommend seeing an occupational therapist or talking to your pediatrician first about it, just to get some input. OT is then going to be able to really take a look at what's going on with the system. So, are there some sensory struggles? Is there some learning difficulty? Is there just like strengthening that needs to happen? Is the core, did we skip some milestones? Maybe we didn't crawl long enough, is the core strong enough to, be able to support some of those fine motor skills?
Now, Katie, you said something really interesting there. Did we not crawl long enough? And I know this
Mhm,
really sound to a lot of parents, it seems like because one of my kids just stood up and walked off.
mhm.
But why is crawling important?
So it sounds really mean, but I always tell those parents, push your kid down, like push them down again, knock them over because crawling helps the body, it builds the core, right? It builds your cross body movement patterns. And that motor planning that they learn during the crawling phase is really important and integral to using both hands and to discriminating from left and right, for the visual motor piece of learning their body in space and where they're going, that forward movement, on all fours. And then it's going to also build, that's also the importance of tummy time, right? It's going to build your back muscles a lot more, as well as the ability then to bring the core, like both sides, and co-contract all of those muscles together. So, and your back is just as important as your regular abdominal muscles, which we think of as the core.
Absolutely. And I think of this often. Duncan couldn't skip,
Mhm,
and his occupational therapist said, well, we have to teach him to skip in
mhm.
order for him to be able to learn to write his letters.
Yeah.
Why does that make a difference?
Yeah, so the sequencing piece of that and the motor planning are really important, and that you'll see that translates to spacing and orientation on the page, and even like letter building and the sequence of how the letter is formed in hand movements. If you can't do it on a big scale, then it's going to be super hard to do it on the fine motor side, fine scale.
And I cheated and looked at all the questions that parents ask us, because boy, did we have a lot of them. So I
Yeah.
wonder if maybe you could answer the question of what are things that I, as a parent at home at maybe the breakfast table, could do to promote
Mhm.
that fine motor skill development?
Mhm. A lot of times I usually suggest like anytime that you have a package, or baggies, those kinds of things, like encourage your child to do that. Encourage them to open their own containers. Um, a lot of play related stuff, even meal prep. Like you can have them working on pulling apart, like if you're making a salad, the pieces of lettuce, or washing things. Um, and, a lot of just like the spontaneous things that come up in meal prep, cutting is also another like sequencing type activity. But anything, that's going to have kind of those innate built-in ways of having challenging their grasps and their coordination piece.
Okay. All right.
Oh,
Tweezers, those kinds of
yes.
things, anything
Yep.
like that.
Tongs
Lego,
are really great. Yep.
Legos, those things.
Legos. Yep.
Perfect. All right.
Yeah.
So talk to me now about letter formation. I know
Mhm.
you and I had this conversation last week where we were talking about building letters from the bottom and building letters from the top and those kinds of things.
Mhm.
What should I be, if I have a child who has not yet emerged as a writer, should I be
Mhm.
encouraging that top to bottom writing piece?
Yeah. That's a good question. So a lot of times, especially when I'm, working with children that are struggling with formation, I like to provide the structure of building the letter in a consistent and certain way. Um, Frequently, we do the top down approach, right? But sometimes some kids learn their builders, right? They like to work from the bottom up.
Particularly
And
boys.
so, yeah. So a lot of times I will kind of see, okay, what's functional? Are they able to form the letter and it's legible and it's, one single stroke, um, with building up? And if it is functional, then that's fine. You don't have to, fix it. But the big thing, I think the biggest piece is consistency. So however you're teaching them and whatever your approach you're using, it's important to keep that consistency and really ask for that across the board.
And when we talked last week, we had a fascinating conversation about grips. So before
Yes.
we go on, I would like you to talk a little bit about grips and how you help a student hold the writing utensil
Hmm.
properly.
Yeah. I tend to not default to grips immediately. So a lot of times I like to play with the type of instrument. I have actually an example of like a little mini pencil. So it's half the size of a regular pencil, and in little hands, this pencil can do wonders. So a lot of times decreasing the amount of pencil that they're having to hold. I like to work before I even go to the pencil, I like to work with a crayon or something that's going to provide a little more resistance, right? And keeps it fun because it's colorful. Um, and then,
So I'm going to stop you there for just a hot
sure.
second, because I know the
Yeah.
answer, because I asked you this question before, but
Uh-huh.
why would a crayon be
Yeah.
a better experience than a pencil?
Yeah. So the crayon's going to create more resistance. So you're building, it's a good way to build that stamina and strength in the grasp and in the hand as you're coloring or as you're writing. And it's gonna, for kids that maybe have some sensory needs and are sensory seeking, it's gonna give greater proprioceptive input. So that's giving them a better feel and understanding of where their fingers are and how their fingers are working together.
And you'll even default to a crayon with an older student if they are
Yes.
holding the pencil too tightly. Do I
Yes.
remember this correctly?
Yeah, so sometimes I might go back a few steps, kind of thinking of those building blocks. I might go back a few steps to a crayon just to work on grading, like how much they're pressing. We don't want to break the crayon, or I might use even they're called finger crayons or stacking crayons, and that's going to have them isolating their finger more and a more pronated grasp, so that they can kind of practice with it's a pre-tripod grasp. Um, and then it brings it back to then you can kind of build it up from there again. So just for a short period.
We've got a good question here. She says, my 4-year-old breaks his crayons. So
Mhm.
what type of crayon do you recommend?
Yeah, so the thicker ones won't break as easily, and
The
it
ones that are
requires.
like the size of my finger kind of
Yes.
crayons.
Yep. Yep. And it requires less for them to hold the thicker ones if that's, hard. They get the input quicker. But the finger crayons are also great. They don't break as well or as easily.
All right.
They're more
And
cone
if you
shaped.
have a child who is still sensory seeking as far as putting things in their mouth and things like
Mhm.
that, in that kind of capacity, is it not yet time to begin to use crayons, or what kind of boundaries, I guess, do you put around?
Yeah, that's a good question. So typically that's more of like a sensory type thing. Are you talking about like putting things in their mouth?
Well, Ambrosia's younger child eats the
Uh,
finger crayons. So how do we
gotcha.
prevent that?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say definitely distinguishing, like it's not a food, right? We don't put them in our mouth. But you can substitute it with something else. So if they want to put the crayon in the mouth, then maybe like have using a chewing necklace or a chew tube or something that's different for them to, be able to put in their mouth safely and then also use the crayon. So you can kind of distinguish that for them.
Gosh, I just had a flashback to Owen, who's now 17, when he had a clip with a chew tube on it so that he wouldn't put
Yep.
things in his mouth except the chew tube. I remember that
Yep. Yeah.
very well.
Yes. Definitely can honor that need, but also create that boundary of crayons don't make it to our mouth.
So let's talk a little bit about older children and resistance to using.
Mhm.
Why is the connection between, now I only have a pen sitting here on my desk today, but why
Yeah.
is the connection between handwriting and neurological input so important?
Yeah. So it goes back to that motor learning and the memory piece. The actual physical pen and paper and writing is going to it's a multisensory experience, right? So it's a way for our brain it has more, almost providing more hooks for the information that we're writing for it to stick. And then it helps with the memory and recall and retaining that information. So it's really about that multisensory experience and the fact that the motor learning and motor planning piece is going to help with the recall and retention of the information. Our brains light up.
We have parents who often say to us, I just gave up and we
Mhm.
just keyboard.
Yeah.
How is the keyboard not going to give us the same type of sensory input as a writing instrument?
Yeah, so the keyboard is a lot more simple of that motor pattern, right? The motor planning. And it's not going to have our brains light up differently with just a keyboard tapping sensation versus the motor planning and patterns that are incorporated in handwriting. So because our brains are taking in all the information of like the tactile touch of the pencil and the paper and the sound even of the pencil on the paper, pen on the paper and writing, and then the motor patterns and movements of our fingers, all of those are coming in sensorially to our brains and it's activating it in such a different way than typing would.
I do remember reading an article in a dysgraphia journal a couple of years ago saying that
Mhm,
they've done MRIs with
mhm.
kids who are physically writing and typing, and
Yep,
the neurological input with a keyboard is the same across the board. It
yeah.
doesn't get slotted in to their brains in the same way. In fact, I remember a Reader's Digest article several years ago. The University of California, one of the campuses, does with their
Mhm,
Psychology 101 students, they split the class. Half of them
mhm.
have to take notes with a pen, and the other can take notes on the keyboard, and then they test them along the way. And those handwritten note takers had better retention for content year over year
Yeah,
over year of testing than those who were keyboarding. Priscilla asks
exactly.
an interesting question here, and this allows me to also step into you being able to relate your personal experience with Isla. She says, is
Mhm.
there any not known correlation between early writing and poor eyesight in the future? To be more
Mm.
direct, do you think that teaching writing early, if they seem ready, causes a strain on the eyes that may increase the need for glasses when they're a little older?
Hmm, that's interesting. I wouldn't say necessarily that it would, as far as acuity goes, make a difference. If their body's ready and they're ready and they're eagerly learning, I think it's great to move on ahead. And every kid is different, right? We all kind of learn at our own pace and have our own, you know, way of developing and moving forward. But I do think it's important to keep in mind the visual motor piece. Um, and that goes hand in hand with like the hand-eye coordination, you know, throwing a ball, can they catch a ball? You know, those skills are definitely going to inform their visual motor in handwriting and in schooling. Um, so some of the things it brings to light, my 6-year-old had was diagnosed with convergence insufficiency recently by a developmental optometrist, and this there is a lot of kids that go fly under the radar for this type of visual motor um, challenge because it's not very like it's not very commonly known about, and it's very subtle. So my daughter was very she loved school, but she really struggled with neatness in her handwriting, with committing the letters to memory and recall. Um, and she really struggled a lot with reversals. And she would always complain like her eyes kind of hurt or she had headaches, which we thought was odd, you know, for being 6. Um, so we took her to a developmental optometrist and they diagnosed her with the convergence insufficiency. And that's really where the eyes are not working, they're not teaming together and working well to be able to create one picture. So we didn't realize the letters were dancing on the page for her. It never looked the same, right? So, it is important to kind of think about that when they're young. If they haven't quite solidified their hand-eye coordination, that is going to impact their ability to really get a solid foundation for their letters and numbers and recalling that, and also then writing them, right, and building them.
Sure, absolutely. I will tell you, as a Demi's special needs consultant for the last 9 years, I talk with parents so often who will say, if you are seeing an academic experience where you have had a successful day and then an unsuccessful day, or you have a child who has, I think, Katie, you taught me the term emotional dysregulation. In other words,
Mhm.
they're 0 to 60 in a hot second.
Yep.
It would be well worth your time to make sure that vision is not a mitigating factor. And
Yes.
what Katie and I are talking about here is not acuity, as Katie has described. It's whether their eyes track together across a page. Convergence insufficiency is only one of a myriad of diagnoses that it could be, but ruling that piece out, I can tell you, is so enormous. And I've learned that over the years, particularly working with Dr. Karen Halinga, who is the author of our Spelling UC program. Karen taught me that when a child is resistant to academics, when a child is what a parent defines as lazy, there's something we need to uncover. And it's up to us to be the parental detectives to figure out what is wrong. Because she said, everybody wants to learn. No one's really lazy.
Yeah,
A
absolutely.
good question for you here, Katie. Do you find it alarming if a 12-year-old doesn't hold the pencil well or in a traditional way? Should I encourage correction with that? And if so, where do I begin?
Here, I would say, at 12, they've solidified a lot of their motor patterns, right? So they're going to have to unlearn to fix whatever the problem is presenting. I frequently say if it's functional and they're writing well, don't feel the need to fix it. I see a lot of adults functionally writing with pretty silly, or not silly, but pretty interesting grasps. Yep. And if it's functional and they're able to write legibly, and somewhat efficiently, it's okay. If your child is struggling with the legibility and or stamina even, in being able to write for like a paragraph or longer things, then I might want to address it with them. And at that age, you're able to kind of reason. You're able to say like, look, here's why it's not functional, and here's how we're going to address, and bring them along with it. So you're getting their buy-in and motivation, hopefully. It's not going to be a power struggle to change.
Absolutely. And then again, sometimes you can have a child with absolutely lousy handwriting who just chooses to do that. I mean,
Yeah.
Lucas is a great example of that. Katie's husband is my eldest son, and his handwriting mirrored that of either a pharmacist or a physician for years. He would bring us notes and say, what does this say? And we would laugh and say, well, you wrote that note. And one day he just decided not to have poor handwriting anymore. And he was almost an adult at that point in time. And overnight, his handwriting went from illegible to beautiful. And so I tell that story because I want to encourage parents to keep fighting the good fight, but it may just be an executive function skill that they need to cultivate.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, I a lot of times will try to build in that ownership with the kiddos, and like really owning like it's your name. We're gonna write it as, write it the best we can, because it's part of becomes part of our identity, right? With our signature and writing our name on the top of every page for school. So, kind of getting their buy-in as far as like why it's important and that it's a piece of them, like it's an identity piece, can also help kind of create that internal motivation.
Right. And this is something we don't think about as homeschoolers. We have to teach our kids to sign their name. I remember vividly the first time I had to have Owen sign a document. Now he's my sixth kid. You'd think I'd kind of cottoned on to this sooner, but I said, here, I want you to sign this. And he very carefully printed his name. I'm like, no, whoops, my bad. Okay, you're going to have to learn how to sign your name. So,
Yep.
and so we don't think about that. So including it in our conversation today is just to bring it to the front of your mind. So I have some really good questions here for you, Katie. By what age should a child be exhibiting correct finger grasp? And do boys delay compared with girls typically?
That's great. So yes, boys tend to be a little bit later in the blooming. But it also, it varies child to child. So I would say by six, you should have a pretty good solidified grasp. So going into like late kindergarten, early first grade, or at least by the end of first grade, you should have a pretty good foundational tripodal or quadrupodal grasp on the pencil.
And is this grasp
Mhm.
an alternative if you have a
Absolutely.
child who's struggling with this grasp?
Yes, absolutely. I think that lends to a lot more stability. And that's a good adapted grasp. Having it between both fingers is going to give you a lot more stability to the pencil. Um, but it feels similar enough to that grasp for formation.
Okay, so that leads me to the next question, which is really terrific. As an
Mhm.
occupational therapist, how do you distinguish between typical handwriting struggles versus learning challenges such as dysgraphia, dyslexia, or vision issues in a
Mhm.
child who's older than 8?
Yeah. So that's really good. So a lot of times if it's pervasive and there's not a lot of movement, so you've hit that big brick wall, and your child is just frustrated and not able to um, have any wiggle room, with whatever you've thrown at them and tried so far. That's typically when I say, okay, you need to go to consult with a neurologist or a neuropsychologist, and they can help you really suss out if it's a learning related disorder.
And I would also say that vision piece that we talked about
Mhm.
earlier is an
Yes,
essential part of ruling out mitigating factors.
absolutely. And I working with Isla's developmental optometrist, I really learned the distinction of like body language and what you're seeing for your child. So like if you have a child that's very close to the table always when they're doing their work, that's a pretty good sign, yes,
Mhm.
that that there is some visual processing struggles. Also, if there's a lot of reversals, so your B's and D's or your P's and nines, that's typical, or even G's and Q's. That's typical when they're first learning. So you might see some of them up until age 6, but if you're seeing it beyond like 6, 7, 8, and it's still persistent, then you might cue into there's a vision thing that I need to rule out first before I go further. So yeah, I would say vision is the first piece to rule out before then you go on to the learning disability type diagnosis.
And as a parent, you can sit across the table from your student and
Mhm.
watch them read, watch how their eyes track. Now, let me also say, I have 2 children who've had vision issues that needed resolution. And one of those, his vision issues did not even present until he hit
Mhm.
puberty. He had no vision and tracking issues until puberty, and then he gave up the desire to read. And frankly, I blamed it on his telephone, his cute little pocket device. But the phone wasn't the issue. It was the fact that with the hormones of puberty, his tracking became skewed. And a good developmental optician can set a child up and actually measure how frequently they do what's called a saccadic sweep, where they go
Mhm.
back to the words again. And whatever the typical number is, Owens was 4 times that. So he was reading one sentence multiple times to sort of grasp the content. Vision therapy was a huge game changer for him. So I can't
Yeah.
say enough good things about it. Lots more
Yeah.
questions here for you, Katie. How does lighting of the brain differ between print and cursive? I'm
I
doing
love that.
cursive with my 14-year-old son, and he still struggles with remembering the shapes of several letters, even when we work on him. Is it okay to
Mm.
continue with cursive? And he does typing as well. So
Yeah.
I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, I think cursive is a great next step, as long as the basic print is there. Cursive will create flow for them. It will help them in a lot of, just kind of fine tuning of the handwriting skill. So, and a lot of people that they either gravitate, they're either printers or they love to write in cursive because it's faster. So I would say definitely like, do a little bit of detective work as far as why that might be, and if it's consistent on the letters. It could just be a recall thing. And it could be that that's just solidified or it's a little bit confusing for them
And if I
to
was
get that.
having a consult with this particular mom, I would definitely say to rule out the vision piece. Because
Yes.
at 14, if there's
Yeah,
still an issue, vision is a mitigating factor here. So
absolutely. Yep.
here's a good question. I really like this one. How do we build stamina with learning issues We have very little extra time and the demand is high. She's going into high school next year. So how do you build stamina? What do you do?
Yeah. Yeah. So I typically would love to see a lot of my kiddos even, they need a lot more gross body movement and strengthening. So any chance you get just to even like away from pen and paper, hand strengthening, doing the monkey bars or having a little like home exercise program for a teenager. Obviously there's that motivation piece on what they will do, but encourage some using some therapy for hand strengthening or working with like if they love to build, like even, I've seen teenagers make masterpieces with Legos. So just encouraging, like just because they're above the age of 8 doesn't mean that they can't still play and still really benefit from arts and crafts and like all of those pieces that incorporate the fine motor and building those skills and strength.
Priscilla says this is her last question, but I don't know. So I won't hold you to that, Priscilla, but I love the question. It says, how do I know how much writing to expect for my almost 10-year-old to accomplish? A paragraph, a page, skipping lines. She seems pretty stressed when she needs to write a paper as a first year. I guess she means a first year high schooler. How do I help by writing her a keyword outline and her rough draft? When I encourage her to write, she gets emotional and it took a really long time. I'm hoping to strike a balance, but I don't want to push unnecessarily as a homeschool parent. Boy, this is, I'm telling you, half the homeschool moms are saying, yes, they understand exactly what you're asking. So
there's a lot of demand in our educational expectations on our kiddos. And because each kiddo is unique in their needs and what's going on for them, it can be hard to kind of decide, what the right fit is for them. I would say really trying to get an understanding of what's causing the frustration or what's, is there a lack of confidence, and what's causing the lack of confidence? Is there like a lot of pressure that she's putting on herself internally as far as like it has to be right the first time? A lot of kids have a hard time with like the draft versus the final version and the whole editing process. I, as an adult, have a problem with that. So, but just like encouraging, taking that pressure off and relieving that pressure as much as possible, and helping them to thrive by creating an excitement in the learning process, without the high pressure demand of this has to be done in a certain way. So yeah, I would say take a step back, maybe even have a conversation with her about what's going on for you and how can we make this fun and exciting for you again.
And I think, Priscilla, you have the right end of the equation as far as scribe for her in the first draft.
Yeah.
Compositional writing is the most difficult thing we ask kids to do because you have to think of what you want to say, how you want to say it, how you want to punctuate it, how to spell it, all those things all at one time. And it really gets all the way down to, as Katie has described, your core strength and how your backside is parked on the chair. If you can take the pressure off and create the first draft for her, then it becomes an editorial experience, as Katie has said, and it makes it a lot easier to get to the end game without drama and frustration.
The other thing kind of going along with that, with frustration in general and kiddos that are just really stuck and it's become a power struggle in getting them to do what they need to do academically, take them away from the table and create this whole other, go to the park, do something different, change up the environment and make it, just shake things up so that it's novel and new and feels different. Because a lot of times it just becomes so grueling and such a power struggle. And it's hard it's hard for the parent to really know where to go from that. So I really encourage just get creative with it and shake things up that way too.
And Donna's asked a good question here. Can you compare advantages and disadvantages of printing in cursive? I know we talked about this a little bit, but is there, as a parent of two dyslexics, I was always taught that if you learn to write in cursive, it's less neurological load because every time you have to pick up the pencil, it raises the neurological load. But what else do you have to say about that, Katie?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the biggest piece really is in that flow and the sequencing. And like you said, like not having to start and start and stop as much. That flow, that thought flow is going to be that's why it's a lot more efficient, right? In the note taking and that kind of thing. So with print, it's a lot more um it depends on their type of thinking too, like if you're a very outline type thinking, you might want to print. You might be gravitating more towards that. But for our those that are more like eloquent in their thought process and their patterning, the cursive may be more create more of a flow for them from thought to then pen and paper, if that makes sense.
So no right or wrong per se. What works
Correct.
well for one student might work differently for another.
Yes, and it's good to have those skill sets in your toolbox, right? But just like we all have different ways of learning and how our brains interpret information differently, depending on those learning styles, one person might really prefer the impact of print writing, while another might really prefer the flow and the efficiency of, cursive writing.
Ambrosia's asked me to show that adapted grasp again. So I'm a lefty,
Yeah.
so I'm automatically disadvantaging you guys, but I'll do it with my right hand. Instead of holding it this way, which is the typical grasp, what we're doing is we're resting it between the first and second fingers, and then we're grasping it. And for some kids, particularly if they have weak motor skill development, that's an easier way to hold the pencil. So hopefully that
Yeah.
helps you all. Another question, Katie, this is a great one. It says, a child in my class is 10 and a half and not able to write legibly. He's able to
Mhm.
convey his thoughts vocally, and he was
Mhm.
given a lot of help for his learning disability, handwriting. In spite of that, there's no change in his handwriting, and he also struggles to read. Is all of that connected?
I would say yes, absolutely. Our systems are so intertwined. And so it could be a motor learning, motor planning type thing. As far as just being able to commit that, and maybe the strategies that, have been presented haven't quite hit the marker for him yet. So I'd say don't give up, but also, switch it up a little bit and see if he doesn't have a diagnosis of dysgraphia or something like that. That also might be something for the family to pursue as well, just to kind of get a finer idea of what the needs are specifically. And the vision piece again.
Again, that vision piece,
Yes,
I can't say
vital.
it enough. It is so huge. And the challenge with it is they have no paradigm to know that their eyes are betraying them. So they have no way to even convey to you it's not working. So this is a good question. And it says, so do you support cursive handwriting? Why does Montessori encourage teaching cursive first? And I honestly don't know the answer to this. So maybe you do,
Yeah.
Katie.
Yeah, you know what? Even with all of my experience and knowledge, I'm not, it's still kind of up in the air as far as just, developmentally, why one over the other. There's really not a lot of clarity. It's all handwriting, right? It's just different styles. I know way back when they did introduce cursive a lot sooner and maybe as a primary, like they're saying. I think foundationally for kiddos, it's a lot more basic and understandable for them to see the print block letters and build those letters out of shapes that we already use. So I use a lot of the straight line and the curve, and how do those shapes go into forming the letters. So we're building them. And so it just meets kids where they are developmentally as far as their understanding of the world and space, right? Where the curves and the connected letters are a little bit more complex for a simple, for the simple that's needed for the younger kids. So that's why I tend to lead with print over cursive, and then cursive is a nice addition once they've mastered print and understand their alphabet. But there are also a lot of other, ways of approaching that. So I wouldn't say one is correct over the other. It's just how you approach it. And again, what your child specifically needs.
Right. And I think also as a lefty teaching 5 out of 6 of my kids who are righties,
Mhm.
I taught them connected printing, which is different than cursive. So the
Yeah.
letters are connected, that neurological element of less strokes up and down, on the page, off the page is
Mhm.
there, but it is a more modified than the traditional cursive method. And a couple of you have asked, how come we don't teach cursive anymore? Because we don't allow time in schools to teach a lot of things that were taught
Yeah.
25 years ago. That has to do with the fact that legislators set academic agendas instead of educators. But this is a
I
good
was gonna
question
yeah.
from Anna. She says, if you've ruled out vision and the child is still trying to use a double fist grasp, how do you break this? The only success is with pencil grip, but without it, they go back to the double fist grasp at that age.
Mm,
So what do you
mhm.
suggest?
Yeah. So if the pencil grip is working, great. I would say stick with that until the motor patterns are really ingrained enough. And like our brains need so much repetition in doing the right, like not the right, but the same pattern over and over again. So maybe they just need the feedback that the grip is providing in their hand. And then maybe it's a motor learning thing that they just need that for a while. I've seen kids use grips for most of grade school into middle school, and then they're able to suddenly like, oh, I don't need this thing anymore, and they're good. But it again, it goes back to the motor learning piece that if it works, you don't have to fix it. It doesn't have to look a certain way. The outcome is really what we're gunning for.
There are actually some writing implements. This one's a
Mhm.
cheater because this has a grip built
Built in.
into it. So so I find this is better for me as far as being able to hold a pen for a
Mhm.
lengthy period of time. Here's a question, Katie, that perhaps you can help us with. Donna asks, who's qualified to give an official diagnosis of dysgraphia?
Mhm. I typically refer to a neurologist, a pediatric or developmental neurologist, or you could go neuropsychology route. And they usually have the tools to distinguish between all of the learning disorders. Um, I've also heard that like some of my families have gone to their developmental pediatrician. But again, like usually the developmental pediatrician will then refer on if they feel like, you know, that's needed.
Right. What type of optometrists do we recommend? We've seen several who are knowledgeable about learning issues and vision. That's a good question.
Mhm.
My recommendation is always to find a developmental optometrist. How about you, Katie?
Yep, same. I work specifically, I think in Maryland, maybe even East Coast. The big name is Visual Learning Centers of America, and they have a lot of good resources online. So they have a lot of educational pieces that might be helpful. But yes, developmental optometrist is the way to go. They have the understanding of the foundation of development.
I also don't want to sound like I am dissing educators here because I'm not in any way, shape, or form. But some states have school districts who receive a differential amount of money for students who are given a diagnosis. So
Mhm.
I encourage you to go spend coin, find someone outside of the school district to help you to make sure that the diagnosis is accurate. And
Yeah.
that always is uh, a diagnosis isn't going to solve your child's dilemma. I know I paid an enormous amount of money many years ago to get a dyslexia diagnosis for my 5th child, and then I still had to figure out how to educate him.
Mhm.
So a diagnosis is only a tool. But let me say something as an aside: don't define your children by a diagnosis.
Mhm.
Um, to me, it's so important to say, this is my son Duncan, and he loves to hike and he loves anything to do with the outdoors. And he is fascinated by everything to do with space, instead of saying, this is my son Duncan and he has dyslexia, because it's a huge difference. We want to define our kids by what they can do, not by what they
Mhm.
can't do.
And a lot of times you'll find that we get kind of stuck in like what they can and can't do and what's defined in the textbook version of like, autism or dyslexia or dysgraphia. And we forget that like it looks different from individual to individual. And and we don't want to define them by that diagnosis because it leaves room for so much more creativity and them to show you what they are able to do.
Sarah asked a question. So you gave a great recommendation as far as Visual Learning Centers of America, but
Mhm.
how do you find a good OT? How do you
Mhm.
find a good neurological? Where would you start?
Yeah. So for OT, I definitely, the pediatric OTs are gonna know the developmental pieces, and they're going to know that foundational framework for handwriting. They're going to be a lot more familiar with handwriting. OT is such a broad discipline, so I would say definitely find a pediatric based OT, even if they're not. Pediatric OTs can also work with adults, so it's just more specific in their experience with development.
This is a great question too. Christy says, we have a diagnosis of dysgraphia. We're going
Mhm.
for testing for an IEP for high school. What accommodations should be in place?
Yeah. A lot of time. So giving more time, giving more adaptation room. So requests for, if they need specific setup um, for their writing assignments, um, if they need, somebody like help dictating or ability to, if typing is a little bit better for them, ability to use the computer in that way. But yes, anything adapting the assignment so that there's decreasing the frustration as much as possible and setting them up for success.
And Christy, you're very wise to get something in place, because if you're looking for accommodations at the college level, if you wait till they're a junior or senior in high school, the College Board is going to do zero for you. And I know
Yeah.
this personally because I walked that walk with my son Duncan, who had a diagnosis of dyslexia. And we didn't start the accommodation process in high school until he was a sophomore. And we were too late. The College Board would do nothing for us. But I got
Mhm.
wise with my younger son, who has a very mild form of dyslexia. We started putting procedures and processes in place when he was in 8th grade, and he received those accommodations. Here's why they're important, because by the time you get to college, if you have an IEP or you have accommodations in place, the college still has to honor them. And actually, Katie, or maybe you remember this, when Shelby was at Towson,
Mhm.
because she had literal hand strength issues, they were able to assign someone to be a note taker for her
Yes.
in class. And
Yep.
let me tell you, folks, that's huge when you get to college, because the volume of writing increases exponentially. So,
Yeah.
Christy, good for you for putting that in place, and best of luck for you as you go forward with that process.
Yeah.
One more question here, Katie. It says, a child who is 11 years old and able to write his understanding beautifully, but his handwriting is not legible, and he is being guided to rewrite his work. Does rewriting help a child improvise his handwriting, is what is written, but I think what she means is help them improve their
Mhm.
handwriting.
Yeah. So if you think about handwriting as the motor planning and motor learning piece, kind of like riding a bike, right? Um, you have to ingrain the patterns that worked, right? I keep trying to correct the correct because correct can look different, for one kid to another. But you want to reinforce the same patterns that work well, right? That create that legibility and that flow to handwriting. And you want to practice, 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 practice. That's not 20, 30, 40 minutes of practice. That's 5-minute increments that are stress free. Um, small bits, but consistent, and consistency is the big piece. Because once the skill is acquired, right? Once you know how to learn, you know how to ride a bike, you can jump on that bike and go, and it comes back and you can shake the rust off easily. So it's about ingraining those motor patterns efficiently in the brain that it becomes second nature.
And you said something really important there, Katie. So I'm going to make you expand on that a little bit. Why
Mhm.
small increments instead of a long
Yes.
increment?
Yeah. So if you think about our tolerance for stress, right? And so how our brains work when we're stressed or when there's a lot of pressure, our frontal lobe actually shuts down when we're in high stress situations, right? So it's not efficiently working as well. And our sensory system takes over a lot more quickly. So if you are it has to do with stamina and learning, right? You want short bursts of good quality learning at time and less pressure so that the brain is most able to capture all of that learning. And then the longer that you go, the fatigue will set in. And so it's going to create more of that frustration. So you want a fresh and ready, and then do a little bit, great work. Let's, be done and come back to it later.
So, Katie, I think that's wonderful. And I can't believe we've had this wonderful conversation. We're almost at the end of the hour. Before we get to the end of the hour, would you tell parents about the resources that you have available to them through Courage to Flourish?
Sure. Yes. So I am working on creating a program for handwriting, just realizing how much of a need there is. This summer, I'm offering programs in person in Maryland, but also I hope to have virtual bundles in conjunction, bringing strengthening exercises using yoga. So we're creating mindfulness and body awareness in addition to working on our handwriting skills. So pairing it with different aspects to make handwriting fun and exciting. I also do a summertime tune-up when kids are not in school. Sometimes they tend to regress in some of their skills. So it gives them some fun practice and you guys good resources as parents to help them practicing during the summertime, honoring that that's their space to kind of take a break from school, the grueling aspect of school. So it can be found in flourishing.littles.com, and I have an email sign up for getting bundle deals and things upcoming. And then also you can book a consult with me if you're looking for just ways to address your specific child's needs and you want to talk more specifics for your child. I can be available to kind of workshop and problem solve and help bring some clarity to that.
Absolutely. And that information, of course, will be included in the show notes and it will be up on our website. Katie, we're almost at the end. What advice would you give parents in our closing comments today?
Yes. So I did mention some of the pieces, but at least the 5 big things that I always say is tap into the brain body connection for your child. So use those big movements for the fine motor piece. So if they're really struggling with their letters, make the letters with their body or create exercises that's going to warm their body up and prep them for then sitting at the table. Multi-sensory approach. So use different mediums for creating written work. So sand, flour, Play-Doh, go outside, play in nature, create artwork with the letters. Noodles is a fun one. Wet spaghetti noodles and building your letters with that. And then the visual processing piece, keep it fun, but like work on those visual motor skills of catching a ball, get outside, crawling. Even if you have a 10-year-old, they can still crawl through tunnels and do obstacle courses, right? So just remember, play is a big way of creating that motor learning piece for kiddos. And then, yeah, consistency is the biggest piece to the handwriting formation and skill building. So keep it consistent and keep it short and sweet and decrease that frustration as much as possible.
There's no, the curriculum police will not come after you if you scribe for your child. So that's a great place to start
Yes.
and it keeps them in the creative and the writing piece. But at some point, putting that pencil on paper and being able to make that neurological connectivity is going to be huge for your
Yes.
students. So we really want to encourage you to continue to follow that information. We have a couple of blog posts that will be as follow-up. Links to Flourishing Littles and Courage to Flourish will both be in the show notes. And we want to thank you all for joining us today. You'll be able to find this information both as a webinar and as our podcast at the Demi Learning Show. I'm excited that Katie joined me today. This was a hugely beneficial conversation, and I appreciate all the parents who asked the terrific questions that you were able to answer for them, Katie. Thank you so much for joining me. I think this was so excellent. We might have to do this again sometime.
Yes.
So
Thank you
thanks
for
again
having me.
for joining us today, everyone, and we'll look forward to having you join us again soon. Take care.